Imagine being torn from your home, forced onto a ship with hundreds of others, and taken across an ocean to a land where you're treated as property. This harrowing journey wasn't just a nightmare for millions of Africans, it was a reality spanned over 4 centuries. Today, we are diving deep into one of the darkest chapters of human history, the transatlantic slave trade. From the 16th to the 19th century, the transatlantic slave trade was a vast and brutal system that reshaped entire continents, economies, and lives. But how did it all begin? And why did it persist for so long? Join us as we explore the rise, the horrors, and the eventual fall of the transatlantic slave trade. Our story begins in the late 1400s. European explorers, driven by the thirst for gold and the desire to find new trade routes, first arrived on the West African coast. They found a thriving network of kingdoms and empires rich in resources and culture, like the Mali and Songhai empires. But it wasn't long before these explorers realized that there was something else they could take back to Europe: people. With the blessing of their monarchs, they began trading goods like guns, textiles, and alcohol in exchange for human lives. At first, African rulers saw the Europeans as just another group of traders. They were willing to trade prisoners of war, criminals, and others who had been enslaved in local conflicts. But this was just the beginning. The demand for labor in the New World, particularly on sugar, tobacco, and later, cotton plantations, would soon turn the slave trade into a monstrous industry. The journey across the Atlantic, known as the Middle Passage, was the most terrifying part of the slave trade. Imagine being crammed into the hold of a ship with barely enough room to lie down, surrounded by the stench of sweat, waste, and death. For those who survived, this was just the beginning of a life of unimaginable hardship. Slave ships were designed to carry as many people as possible, with little regard for their comfort or survival. Up to 600 men, women, and children would be packed like cargo, chained together, and left to endure the long, brutal journey across the ocean. Sickness, malnutrition, and abuse were rampant, and many didn't survive the voyage. In some cases, captains would throw the sick and dying overboard to prevent disease from spreading. For the enslaved, the Middle Passage was the first taste of the horrors that awaited them in the New World. Upon arrival in the Americas, the survivors faced another nightmare: the auction block. Here, they were inspected like livestock, poked and prodded by potential buyers. Families were torn apart as husbands were separated from wives, and children were ripped from their mothers' arms. Enslaved Africans were sold to the highest bidder and sent to plantations, mines, or households where they were forced into back-breaking labor. Their identities were erased, they were given new names, forbidden from speaking their languages, and often converted to Christianity. The conditions were brutal. Overseers used whips, chains, and other forms of punishment to maintain control. Many enslaved people were worked to death, especially in the sugar plantations of the Caribbean, where life expectancy was shockingly low. The transatlantic slave trade wasn't just a horrific crime against humanity, it was also a cornerstone of the global economy. The wealth generated by slavery fueled the rise of powerful nations and the Industrial Revolution. European merchants, American plantation owners, and African elites all profited immensely from this trade in human lives. Ships from Europe would bring goods to Africa, exchange them for slaves, transport those slaves to the Americas, and then return to Europe with sugar, cotton, and tobacco. This was the infamous triangular trade, a cycle of human suffering that enriched the few at the expense of the many. The profits from the slave trade funded the construction of grand cities, universities, and industries in Europe. Yet, this wealth was built on the backs of millions of enslaved Africans. Despite the overwhelming odds, resistance was constant. Enslaved Africans fought back in countless ways, through revolts on ships, insurrections on plantations, and by preserving their culture and humanity in the face of brutality. One of the most significant acts of resistance was the Haitian Revolution, where enslaved Africans overthrew their French masters and established the first independent Black Republic in 1804. This sent shockwaves across the world and inspired other movements for freedom. Meanwhile, in Europe and the Americas, the abolitionist movement gained momentum. Individuals like Oloda Equiano, a former slave who wrote about his experiences, and William Wilberforce, who campaigned tirelessly in the British Parliament, played crucial roles in turning public opinion against the trade. In 1807, the British Parliament passed the abolition of the slave trade ACT, marking the beginning of the END for the Transatlantic Slave Trade. However, it wasn't until 1865, with the end of the American Civil War, that slavery was officially abolished in the United States. But even then, the legacy of slavery would haunt the world for generations. The transatlantic slave trade may have ended over 150 years ago, but its impact is still felt today. The African diaspora, spread across the Americas, Europe, and beyond, carries with it the scars and resilience of those who survived the horrors of slavery. The legacy of slavery is evident in the racial inequalities and injustices that persist to this day. The fight for equality and justice continues as communities around the world confront the enduring consequences of this dark chapter in history. The story of the transatlantic slave trade is one of unimaginable suffering, but also one of resilience, resistance, and survival. By remembering and understanding this history, we honor those who endured it and continue to fight for a world where such atrocities are never repeated. Thank you for watching. If you found this video informative, please like, share, and subscribe for more deep dives into history.